Fierce Education targets higher education leaders, administrators, and faculty, and those driving technology adoption decisions in this new blended learning world. Go to www.fierceeducation.com for all the latest news, tips, and successful case studies of what higher education institutions are doing to better student engagement, ensure equal access, and improve the assessment process. That's www.fierceeducation.com. Welcome back, everybody. It's your time to EdUp on the EdUp Experience podcast, where we make education your business. Dr. Joe Salustio back with you again. I've found some new sound effect buttons. You can check this one out right here.
Welcome to this podcast.
I'm having fun with that one lately. It's like instead of me talking, I can just hit this.
Welcome to this podcast.
Kind of has the same effect. I feel like almost a better effect than me talking to myself, which I do all the time, even when I'm not podcasting, which my wife is starting to be concerned because I'm practicing my intro, and she's like, "What are you doing? And why are you going crazy?" I know I probably didn't get a laugh on that one. I do like to hit sound effects for myself, as my listeners will also notice. But that's not why we're here today to talk about me. We're here to talk about actually some pretty serious goings on within higher education. And I have a couple of guests with me today. I would dare to say I'm in higher ed royalty today. Let me tell you first who I have with me. You'll recognize him. Ladies and gentlemen, his name is David Bain. He's Senior Vice President for Government Relations for the American Association of Community Colleges. David, how are you?
I'm fine. I want to thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for that appreciative round of applause.
Well, they just won't sit down for you, David. Probably not unlike your family every time you walk into the room. And then, of course, joining us today as well, and I can't give her an applause because I feel like she's got a different vibe. Here she comes, ladies and gentlemen.
Yeah.
Her name is Amanda Janice Roberson, and she's Director of Research and Policy at the Institute for Higher Education Policy.
Yeah.
What's up, Amanda?
Not too much. I'm just excited to be here today.
Yeah.
Did you know you're going to get the "oh yeah" button? Because that is one of my personal favorites.
I didn't, but I really like it.
Yeah.
Well, I got more in store for you guys, but you've got something in store for me and our audience, which is to talk about the College Transparency Act, CTA. Of course, let's start with the biggest, burningest question of all, Amanda, and I'm going to start with you. What is the College Transparency Act, and how did it come about? And you've got to answer this in 30 seconds or less. No, you don't really have to. Take your time. Explain it to us because none of us understand.
Well, I am happy to. I would say that the College Transparency Act is probably one of the most important bills that you might not have heard of. And if you don't know already, you need to know that IHEP really loves data. And that might sound a little nerdy, it might sound a little wonky, and it might be, but we know that data answers a lot of questions, and done right, those answers should be objective, free from bias, telling the truth, whether we're ready to hear it or not. And I'm also a researcher, and as researchers, we rely on data. Also, as an organization that manages the group, the Postsecondary Data Collaborative, we know firsthand that our higher education data system is incomplete. And not only that, it's duplicative, inefficient, and burdensome. So put simply, higher education is data rich, but information poor.
Yikes!
And the College Transparency Act is looking to fix that. Across higher ed, a lot of information is collected in a lot of different places, but it can't talk to each other in meaningful ways to answer some really critical questions that we have about higher education. The problem is in both the infrastructure side of things, so how the systems are built, but also the measures and the metrics that we use. So for instance, using our current data systems, we can't count all students and all pathways, and that's a problem. And I would liken this to a semi-truck with a blind spot. Most drivers know not to drive in a semi's blind spot because they could get run over. And the vast majority of students and families don't know about this big blind spot in their data, and they're getting edged out as a result. And so when different folks use the data, like students and families, using it to make important and potentially expensive decisions about where to go to college, how to pay for it, and what to study, they don't necessarily have the information that they need to make the decision that's right for them and their family. And then even more so, policymakers use this information to craft new policies and programs. And if they can't see all students or understand all outcomes, well, then the question becomes, how are they going to be able to ensure that the policy is equitable? And they're not going to be able to. And when students are excluded from the data, they're excluded from the policy. And that's where CTA comes in, because CTA helps to fill those gaps to make sure that we count all students and answer a lot of questions. So I recognize that I took a little bit of a winding road to get to what CTA is, but hopefully that gives you the 30,000 foot picture.
It does, and it brings up like 50 billion questions when we don't have enough time. But you said if students aren't counted, then the students and the families and whoever's making the decision, they can't make an informed decision. Whose fault is it that not all students are counted, or what do you mean by that? And what does that mean? What does that mean for the student who is not counted? And what does that mean for the student who's looking in the data doesn't know that there's a student in that data that's not counted? You know what I mean? There's a lot there.
Yeah,
I mean, that was like 15 questions, by the way.
It was a great group of questions. And I think that it's a legacy that our systems haven't evolved as the post-secondary data system has evolved and has changed over time. And the way our current metrics are constructed worked better for students 20, 30 years ago, but maybe not so much in 2022. And with our current metrics, there's just not a way to compare outcomes for all of today's students. And I did mention this at the outset. I'm a data person, get a little nerdy. And because of that, I, of course, have my two favorite examples where I think are the data that we have for students in particular is falling short. So first is the federal graduation rate. This is the rate that I think most people are familiar with when you mention higher education outcomes, but it only counts students who are first time enrolled in college and enrolled full time. So that number really only captures outcomes for what we used to consider traditional student populations. And this measure worked okay in 2000, but like I said, it's not really working in 2022 because over half of students fall outside of this first-time full-time population now, meaning that at least half of students who attend college aren't being counted. So to really understand how our higher education system serves today's students, we need to make some updates as to which measures we collect.
That's pretty. Look, can I stop you just and say that it's pretty insane, like what you're saying? And for those of us that work in higher ed, we know that the first time freshman completer, it leaves out so much of the population, and it's really a travesty when you think about the upcoming multicultural new majority of student that is an adult student that many times just gets discounted in those metrics.
That's absolutely right. And it's exactly what I'm thinking about when I say that our systems just haven't kept up with how higher education and and the students that higher education systems are serving now.
What the heck is going on?
Exactly. My thoughts exactly. And I think the other thing that I tend to think about when I think about measures that are falling short for students, we know students care about getting an education in large part so they can have this better life for their families and make more money than they would otherwise. And so having an understanding of return on investment and on earnings is really critical for that decision making. And there is information on earnings included in the college scorecard, but it too is falling short, unfortunately, for students. And before they invest their time and money into their education, which of course also has opportunity costs, they need to know what this return on investment is going to be. But right now, the earnings only are available for students who receive federal financial aid, which essentially means that we're missing out on about 30% of students nationwide. And in some places, it's actually worse. In the California community college system, less than a quarter of students receive federal aid, meaning around 75% of students are missing in the data.
And let's be clear, like the community college system in California has like, I don't know what, 2 million students or some ridiculous number?
so many students. And so it's so important that any earnings and employment information is representative of that student population, which they just aren't now. And I think that's when you think about searching for data, that you can just Google it and you can find the information that you're looking for, and that it won't have some of these major blind spots. And so it's really on us as we're thinking about what kinds of policies that can have this huge macro level impact, and what we need to be able to change so that students, when they do look at a search engine to find that information, what they're finding is accurate and representative. And without the information, we can't build the kinds of equitable systems that students deserve and that we all want to see. And so just to bring it back full circle, I think CTA would ensure that all students and their outcomes are visible in our data systems, and so that they have that information as part of the decision making, and so that policymakers have better information to develop policies to support them. And so we need CTA so that students can make more informed decisions and policymakers can enact equitable policies. And we will not see equity in higher ed until CTA passes. No CTA, no equity.
That's simple. Speaking of policy makers, let's bring in David. He's been sitting patiently. He is ready to explode with information here. David, let me ask you first, how does this data, the incomplete data, impact institutions? And what does it look like for community colleges right now who are dealing with, dealing with a multitude of problems, right? Not only data and tracking, but getting students back because of the pandemic, supplementing or the enrollment declines. There's just a lot going on for community colleges. How does this data set impact them?
First of all, Joe, who said I was patient?
Nobody.
Attention.
So thanks for asking that question. And by the way, California community colleges enroll more than one out of every 4 credit students attending a community college across America. There are 116 institutions. The enrollments have dropped declined along with the rest of the community colleges, but we're very proud of the system that has been created in California and allows for students to transfer to the Cal State and UCal system, as well as to go into the workforce and do other things.
Yeah, that's why, before you go ahead, that's why I wanted to make that point to Amanda, because it's really, with Amanda, the number of students, when you think about percentage, right? We say 25% of California community colleges. We're talking about 50,000 people. I mean, that's an incredible amount of data when you think about it. And so it's easy to talk about statistics and get lost on the aggregate numbers, which are massive.
Yeah, and I think, Joe, that's a good point at which to try to bring this down to a very concrete level in terms of the fundamental difference between the data system that we have and the data system that would be created through the Transparency Act. The current system that we have, and most listeners on this podcast will be familiar with it, is the IPED system, Integrated Post-Secondary Education Data System. And under that system, I know it's a mouthful, but once you master it, it's not so bad. Under that system, the data are provided on the student side of things primarily through cohorts. So colleges submit only batch information about how, for graduation rates and for other aspects of their performance, only in a gross group fashion. Whereas under the Transparency Act, it's an individual unit-based data system that allows for much more granular, much more powerful data to be provided about how students succeed and go through the post-secondary education system. And of course, millions of students move from one institution to another, which again is a very important issue for community colleges. But the really big difference, transformative from our perspective about the Transparency Act, is that it would require institutions to provide data on each and every one of their students as they move through their institutions out into the workforce or to another college. And what that would allow policymakers and potential students and their families to do is, as Amanda was just saying, is to have a much better picture of what the likelihood of a student enrolling in a given program or institution is going to have to enroll in another college to complete a program at the community college that they enroll in, or how they're going to fare in the workforce. Currently, we simply don't have the federal government in any way tracking where students go after they leave a college, either into another post-secondary institutions or into the workforce. Amanda referenced the college scorecard, and at the risk of going a little bit further into the weeds on this, under the scorecard, the data is generated or driven by a gathering of information on individual students. But the only students, those individual students that are included in the scorecard and which generate that scorecard information are students who have applied for Title IV student financial aid. So for example, in a place like California, where only a minority of students receive Title IV, then all the majority of students, those, I believe it's now 1.6 or 7 million California community college credit students, and by the way, it was up to 2.7 million at the height of the Great Recession. But that all those students and those students' experiences are not reflected in the data. Under
what?
Can you believe it? I mean, it's
what?
really. I mean, it really is. It really is hard to believe. It's hard to believe when you consider the fact that, and only about 50%, slightly more than that, community college students overall receive Title IV aid, and so are included in the scorecard data and other, well, that's the primary sort of unit types system that exists in the federal government. And so we feel, just to close, that it is essential for the government making this tremendous investment in student financial assistance and allowing students to go to college with federal support, that we have a better concept of how our system is functioning, both in terms of completion, transfer, workforce experience, and then on a more microscopic level, a disaggregation of that data so that we can have a more precise idea based on income, racial, ethnic background, potentially first generation college student, gender, what students are and how they are doing within our post-secondary institutions. It really is sort of how could we have gone this far, this many years without a system that is more reflective of the needs of our consumers.
David, I hear urgency behind your voice. And passion. Why is it so urgent now? And what do you think something like CTA means for institutions if it goes and if it's implemented and whatever, I don't know what the word is, passed or whatever, and you have enough backers and enough data? I mean, why is this so urgent now? What does it mean for students, for equity in higher ed?
Well, it's really past midnight in terms of the need to have this legislation enacted. Why it's so urgent now is because in a House Senate conference on very large competitiveness legislation directed primarily at the economic competition with China, but with other provisions that would support industry, university research, and other things in our country. In this competes and USICA legislation, Senate passed legislation, that there is the Transparency Act is included in the House version of that legislation, not in the Senate version. And so we have an opportunity at this moment to have this legislation enacted into law. We think the bill has a good chance of clearing Congress, despite all the difficulties in getting, significant legislation through both chambers and signed by the president. So we are at a critical moment legislatively in terms of getting this transformative legislation enacted. And I can't say that it's more essential now than it was, say, 5 years ago, or will be 5 years in the future that we have this enacted, but it really is shocking that in a nation where almost 70% of all of our high school graduates go to college, where the federal government provides well over $100 billion a year in student financial assistance. The number was as high as 170, but it's declined, so I'm not going to put a figure out that I'm not sure about. But where the government provides extraordinary sums of funds for colleges, that at the same time that this investment, and as Amanda pointed out, the opportunity cost as well as the direct cost of financing college that students and their families have, that we can't tell a student entering an institution, whatever type of institution it might be, whether it's a community college or a for-profit college or a university. This is typically speaking what students enrolling in this program at this institution can expect to see at the conclusion of their academic experience at that institution. And so it is disturbing to many policymakers and advocates in higher education that we are at 2022, and this legislation, which has been around and introduced, refined, it's generated a good deal of bipartisan support in both the House and the Senate. It's just very unfortunate that the legislation hasn't been enacted. Won't spend time talking about difficulty that Congress has had in general in getting legislation passed. But,
that's just my word for the whole situation.
Cluster.
We got to figure it out.
But we've got to figure it out.
Fierce Education is the place where higher education leaders, administrators, and faculty, and those driving technology adoption decisions in education can access proven methods and best practices as they rethink pedagogy and business models in the new blended learning world. Through its website, www.fierceeducation.com, virtual events, and newsletters, Fierce Education focuses on rethinking higher education in a blended learning world. Fierce Education's key tenets are to use technology for teaching better and reaching learners everywhere, addressing business model changes required to move forward, and workforce preparation for adult learners who are out to reskill. That's www.fierceeducation.com. David, just so you know, Amanda just sent me a text message and asked you to stop talking so that she could jump back in. But I do have one more question for you. Amanda, I'll get to you in a second, but thanks for the text. David, I've heard that there are 160 orgs supporting the bill, including student veterans, and the veterans are, weighing in on this pretty loudly. What is the veteran angle here? And by the way, we're just out of Memorial Day, so shout out to all the vets and active service military members. It's our responsibility to do the best we can to take care of our vets, higher education, and any other industry for that matter. So why is that an important part of this?
Well, in part because veterans and we do salute, their of course their service, and they are provided with relatively generous educational benefits through the federal government that we, in many cases, we've seen them be taken. We've seen them enroll in programs that don't do particularly well for them in terms of their the education and the services that they receive. And so I'm not going to go any further than that, but to say that because there are some institutions that have been viewed as being less than as effective as they might be, and not as concerned about the students as they might be. But that's really beside the point. The bigger point is that the veterans want to see the people that they're focused on served optimally. And of course, we feel that way about our students, but I don't think that this should be viewed as benefiting, frankly, primarily any particular group as important and as strong as we all feel for veterans. It's really about all students. It's about all people in our country, about being able to make the best decision that they can that is immensely consequential to their lives. I know you got another few texts from Amanda, so I'll stop there.
Amanda, please stop. You're blowing me up. David, we're gonna get David off the microphone for a minute. Amanda, will you come in on that? Like what are your thoughts there on the veteran angle, to David's point, and when we're talking about all students and we're talking about counting all students, I want you to again talk about that importance, because I think that we can't say it enough. And I just think about myself as a dad and my kid, as a kid or as an adult going to college and wondering if I'm going to make this, thousands, maybe hundreds of $1,000 decision and not having all of the data available. You think about what a weak position that puts students in when they're making a major life decision. I don't know. I'm just rambling, but I think you get my point.
No, and I think I appreciate the opportunity to sort of double down on the importance of this for all students. And I think for veterans in particular, it is important because their outcomes aren't reported really separately in scorecard data. And so as veterans, I think, are a great example of a group of students who are making this investment backed in a number of ways by the federal government. And they just don't have the information that they need to make sure that they're going to get the return on the investment in the same way that other students and families, adults who are re-engaging in the post-secondary education system, students coming directly from high school, like all of these students deserve and have the right to know what their outcomes are going to be. And so I think veterans are just a great example of a group that should have this information. All students should have this information. And it's not being properly reported, or it's not being adequately reported because our systems are not able to do it the way they're constructed. And so
what do? You take all of this and you put it into and I learned this term recently, a student level data network, which sounds big. And it sounds different than what we have, and it sounds huge as an undertaking. How do we get there? Do people understand how we can get there? Maybe both questions.
So
because I don't know how. So you gotta tell me, because I'm sure there's somebody else that doesn't know either.
I would say that yes, it is a big but really important undertaking, a non-negotiable undertaking that we have to do to make sure that we're serving our students and we're not excluding any students. A student level data network sounds complicated, but it's essentially allowing our systems to communicate better so that we can answer these questions more clearly. And we know that this effort is big and that it's going to take time, which is part of the reason why at IHEP, we've started collaborating with others in the field who are also interested in what implementation would look like and recognize that it's going to be a big and important and potentially complicated process. So we've been working with folks like RTI and AEM to understand what data elements will be necessary to meet the requirements of the legislation, where those data can come from, and what existing standards or frameworks we can leverage. And I think to make it a little clearer, let's think of it as a puzzle. We're looking at what pieces are needed, how they fit together to see that larger picture of higher education, all while removing identifying information to make sure that we're protecting students' privacy. Because that's one piece that we haven't really talked about so far, but it's a really important component, is making sure that when we implement this system, we're balancing it so that we get the information that students sorely need and that they deserve, while we're also protecting their privacy.
Yeah, I was going to ask you that next, because how many individuals have problem, myself included, probably you guys, with being tracked and getting tracked. And of course, our phones are listening to this conversation. As soon as we get on an app where we buy something, it's going to put something in front of us that we just talked about randomly on this podcast, right? Like that's the way the people perceive these things to work, like they're being tracked, and then everybody's worried about data and data privacy. And it is a big issue. How do you balance it? I mean, how do we balance it in the right way so that we can get the information we need but make it as anonymous as possible. I mean, because that is the goal, right?
Absolutely. And I think to your point, in 2022, people are rightfully concerned about data privacy. And there's lots of really upsetting stories out there about data being sold to third parties and people being able to be identified based on that data. But I think there's an important difference between the data that can be mined from cookies on private computers and devices and the administrative data that we're talking about here. It's like comparing, I like a good analogy. It's like comparing crumbly cookies to a bank vault. It's just not quite the same issue. And I'll also say that as the legislation was constructed, data privacy was really at the center of how we really created, I'll say, a privacy sort of structure or scaffolding within the bill and surrounding the bill to try to make sure that we were proactively mitigating some of these concerns about privacy. And I think there are a couple of elements to keep in mind, just some quick examples. So first, data won't be sold. The legislation prohibits the sale of data to third parties. The data can only be used for statistical purposes. The bill references SIPC, which I cannot tell you what that stands for off the top of my head.
Did you say sipping? Because if there's a glass of wine or beer in front of me, I could take care of it. Say that again.
It's SIPC,
SIPC.
SIPC, CIPSEA, and I cannot, the confidential information, if I try to remember, I will butcher it. But I think the important thing to take away is that SIPC means that the permitted uses of the data are really tightly constrained to just statistical purposes. And then I think the other piece is that data are pretty thoroughly Humpty Dumptied. They can't be put back together again. There's no live link to the data, and elements would be housed by NCES, which is a statistical agency with expertise in limiting the identification of data. So I think the quick takeaway is that we've really carefully thought through the aspects of data and security in the College Transparency Act and what that balancing act is to try to ensure that data aren't matched back to individuals or used for anything other than ensuring our system of higher education provides opportunity to everyone, regardless of race, age, gender, background, or any other factor. And our ethos behind this student level data network is that it's a limited amount of data for a limited time and a limited purpose. And SIPC stands for the Confidential Information Protection and Statistical Efficiency Act.
If you looked that up while you were talking, that was amazing. Good work.
I am a woman of many talents.
So to both of you guys, and David, I'll start with you, and Amanda, I'll move to you next, and then we'll move to a final question. But why wouldn't an organization be on board with this? What are the, barriers that we need to overcome to bring more transparency and more data to consumers?
A few of the arguments that have been used against the Transparency Act, and there are some well-connected, powerful organizations that are stridently in opposition to the legislation, and they have successfully cultivated champions in Congress. And this hasn't come up, but there is in fact, there was included in the 2008 reauthorization of the Higher Education Act, which was the last time the Higher Education Act was reauthorized. Included in that bill was a provision that prevents the federal government from creating the type of unit record data system that the Transparency Act would establish. And that was done deliberately to prevent, the creation of what we're talking about this afternoon. So the opposition reached, that level of intensity. And it hasn't dissipated over the ensuing time. And to get back to the legislative situation, why this moment is so important is that, so we're 14 years down the road from the last reauthorization that includes this prohibition. We have no idea when a full-fledged renewal extension of the Higher Education Act with modification might occur. And so we have in this vehicle, the Competes and USICA legislation, the opportunity for getting this new system put forward. But some of the arguments that have been used against it are the concerns about the data being released, security being broached, and personal data about individuals being made available inadvertently. One of the things that, from my point of view, is very important in that is that we have been, in crafting this and working with the many people who've been involved in this legislation, certainly not alone AACC, we've ensured that the data that are provided as individually based as they are, that they are as limited as possible in terms of what they would say about individual students. If for some reason at some point there might be some kind of security breach, which we don't anticipate for a lot of reasons, I feel very secure about the protection that have been built in the bill. And I would also add that fundamentally all the information would be provided through the Transparency Act is already being provided by the more than 60% of all undergraduate students who receive Title IV federal assistance. So their colleges, students are already providing this information to the federal government. So then that does raise the question of, well, then why would people oppose this legislation so vehemently? And I think it's almost, as I understand it, I certainly don't share this view, but it almost becomes an element of faith, if you will, or sort of a mystical proposition in which there are people who feel that just because you go to college, you shouldn't necessarily sign up for inclusion in some kind of a federal database. Which from our point of view ignores the reality that you've got to file your taxes and provide information on that. If you want student aid, which again, most students do, you've got to provide lots of personal information. So obviously we're all providing all sorts of data at all times to federal government and other private entities too, where it's not as secure as it would be under this legislation. So why this is so uniquely threatening to people is hard to say, but as I understand, it's almost a gut-like revulsion or reaction against the federal government, big brother, if you will, having access to data that they wouldn't otherwise, even though I don't particularly think that argument has a lot of force at this point in time. And then it has to be said that to what Amanda was saying when we started, is that colleges have institutional leaders have things that probably they'd rather not have everybody know about, the outcomes of their institutions. I'm reluctant to say that because I don't think it reflects well on the industry that we are and the public support that we need to command in order to deliver, provide what we do. But it almost sort of beggars common sense that that people would not want to have this information made available. But on the basis of what it might say about institutional performance, and there are community college programs that aren't perhaps exactly what every one of our member presidents might want them to be. Every single program, maybe not every single program has a perfect completion rate, or everybody gets a great job coming out of it. But that's what the data is useful for. The data is useful for enabling institutional leaders to make decisions about what programs best serve their students, how to allocate their limited resources. And so apparently some people don't want that information. And it has to be said that there is no substitute for the Transparency Act in terms of the nature of the information it would generate and the comprehensiveness of the information. So there's nothing close to it at this point in time. So it really does make us wonder, why there is the opposition to this that there is, but there is, and it should not in any way be underestimated. Even though, as I mentioned earlier, the legislation does have a lot of bipartisan support in both chambers of Congress, but there are many people, and including some very influential policymakers, who are just, as a former boss of mine said, they say not just no, but hell no, in terms of enacting on this legislation. And so we have, significant opposition here. So that's a little bit of the background.
Well, I really appreciate that, because anytime we talk about supporting something, we want to understand why others don't. When you work in this industry and you think about the amount of data and financial aid and the amount of data we have to provide, and higher ed it's funny because we always talk about ROI and degree value and these things that are related to this Transparency Act. And then at the same time, we're telling students to be flexible and nimble and be able to change careers quickly. And maybe that degree doesn't show an ROI directly to your time in higher ed, but it will 20 years from now. And if we can track that, those things, it will just give people a whole lot more to decide on. Amanda, how do we get involved for somebody who's sitting out here that says, you know what, this College Transparency Act sounds really good. I don't know about it. I want to learn about it. I want to support it. I want to get involved. How might somebody go about doing that?
That is a great question, because we would love to have more folks involved in this, because I think, as David mentioned earlier, we have a really great opportunity with where the bill is in conference between Competes and USICA to get this passed now. Because I think one additional piece that I would add on is that we are still very much waiting for a Higher Education Act reauthorization. But if
aren't we all?
Yeah, right. But if CTA were to be passed as part of this bill ahead of an HEA reauthorization, that means that depending on how long it takes, we may have information from the system to inform policymaking, which is another key use of this system. So wanted to put that on the table. But in addition to the bipartisan, bicameral support that we have in Congress for the bill, we also have a letter, a statement that's been signed by over 160 organizations who are all really excited about what the impact of this could be. So I would say if there are any folks who want to sign on, we would be happy to share the link to that to add to the show notes. But in short, I would say use your voice and join us in calling for Congress to pass CTA. The list of co-sponsors is long, but there's no such thing as too long of a list of co-sponsors. So would love to have more folks out in front and be vocally supportive with us. And yes, CTA is wonky, but it is, like I said at the top, probably the most important bill that you might not have heard of. And people don't think about data on a day-to-day basis like I do, or like we do at IHEP, like David does. But I know many of your listeners do, and they think about fairness and justice and equity. And CTA is really the road to all of those things. So I hope I'm amping your listeners up enough that they'll want to get involved and help us reach the full potential of higher ed using our data-informed voices, because all of us will benefit. So that's how folks can get involved.
Well, you heard it, ladies and gentlemen. With me today, Amanda Janice Roberson from IHEP and David Lane from AACC. Ladies and gentlemen, you've just EdUp'd. Fierce Education targets higher education leaders, administrators, and faculty, and those driving technology adoption decisions in this new blended learning world. Go to www.fierceeducation.com for all the latest news, tips, and successful case studies of what higher education institutions are doing to better student engagement, ensure equal access, and improve the assessment process. That's www.fierceeducation.com.